Hi there, my name is Cameron Montgomery, or Cameron Dreamshare if you follow my fiction work. I gave a talk at a conference in May of 2017 called Restorying Canada. They're making those materials available online, so here is my best attempt to recreate my talk from May of 2017. Visioning Utopia, First Nations Models of Governance for Transitioning from Late Capitalism to Post-Capitalism. When Christopher Columbus sailed up the Orinoco River of Venezuela in 1498, he thought that he had found the utopic Garden of Eden. His crew of sailors were of average European stock. 1 in 10 had physical deformities from malnourishment, incest, and disease, and they were an average of 5 feet tall due to crowding and sickness in European cities and generations of poor hygiene and poor diet. The Taino people who Columbus encountered were tall, muscular, and robust. They were healthy with a varied diet of vegetables, lean meats, and legumes. Columbus searched the river's shoreline for a metropolis, finding instead, quote, an infinity of small hamlets and people without number, more people than all of Portugal. Bartolome, the brother of Christopher Columbus, praised his brother's bravery in exploring across the ocean. But when he himself traveled to Hispaniola, he was disgusted by the barbaric behavior of the Europeans, torturing the natives, cutting off their ears and hands, and slaving them, setting dogs on their babies as a method of coercion. He wrote that the Taino people were culturally opposed to violence, and they had no weapons for torture. Unfortunately for them, the Europeans had many. While wreaking death and destruction on the Taino people across the ocean, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were torturing and killing Jews and other non-Catholics back home in Spain. Social Darwinism and the myth of white supremacy that culminated and came crashing down during the Second World War painted a very specific picture of human progress. The mythology of white gods, narrating history as a story of white greatness, has made it difficult to imagine that colonialism and the capitalist model got it wrong. The story of Canada is popularly told like this. In the beginning, the advanced and civilized Europeans discovered the Americas, where barbaric savages lived in misery and squalor until they were educated and uplifted by the English. The church committed some crimes when they took native children away from their families, but they had the best intentions, and ultimately, it was good for the natives. I remember giving a talk at an event where a boy raised his hand and said, "But in the end, didn't native people benefit from European colonization?" And the answer is that no. Actually, all of Europe benefited from First Nations, and not just stealing their land and resources, but also learning from their highly advanced social structures and profiting from thousands of years of agricultural innovation. First Nations taught the Europeans about medicine, bathing, and good hygiene. First Nations taught the Europeans what democracy looks like, that non-violent civilization is possible, and that the responsibility of a community is to ensure that the entire society is cared for, including the old, the sick, and the young. European explorers brought these so-called revolutionary ideas back with them to their homelands, from First Nations examples. Thomas Jefferson credited the Iroquois Confederacy with his own vision of American Confederacy. He wrote that the concept of democratic freedom came from native peoples, and he contrasted European feudalism against the more enlightened native Confederate model. Irving Halliwell recounted how Benjamin Franklin attended Indian councils and patterned the United States model on the Six Nations model. The leaders of nations back home in Europe were literally driving themselves into extinction through incest, their bodies rotting with gout from eating so much fat and sugar, while laborers in the cities that they governed were starving to death. To say that colonial governments had a lot to learn from First Peoples is a colossal understatement. All of the great things about North America that brought waves of European immigrants to this land, destitute from violence, poverty, and war, all of those good things came from First Nations. From freedom and democracy, to clean water, and a nutrient-rich diet. But that is certainly not the story that was embedded in my cultural imaginaire. The story of the noble savage, so different from the concrete examples available to us in primary source documents. For example, The 20 Huron villages that Samuel de Champlain visited along the St. Croix River in 1604 had approximately 1,000 residents each, some up to 3,500 people, communities whose system of government centered on shared resources. A majority of the commercially produced vegetables in the world today were developed by First Nations' highly advanced agronomics. Intellectual energy was directed toward biotechnology for group sustenance, and First Nations domesticated and cultivated tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, wild rice, pumpkin, squash, peanuts, 34 varieties of berries, including blueberries and cranberries, corn, most beans, quinoa, peppers, maple syrup. The list goes on and on and on. In contrast, the average European was eating wheat, dry hard bread, cold wet gruel, and a gallon of beer a day. The people of Huronia, as Champlain called it, ate a robust, mostly vegetarian diet, relying on hunting meat only in the depths of long winters. Within 40 years of relationship with Europeans, the Huron population was reduced by almost 70%. In the Canadian Maritimes, the Mi'kmaq lived in coastal villages in the summers, feasting on whales and fish, and in the winter they cozied up in wigwams along rivers inland and feasted on moose and caribou. They ate Kostamo, or moose butter, a nutrient-rich concentration of boiled bones. The heart of the winter village was the communal cooking fire. First-hand accounts of Mi'kmaq life recall that Europeans had never in their lives met people as old as Mi'kmaq villagers, some of whom were over 100 years old. Quote, "Because of the communal nature of society and the abundance of food, poverty among the people is virtually unknown. Material things, other than clothing and household goods, are shared equally. Thus the old, sick, infirm, and otherwise disadvantaged are protected from destitution. Endowed with a high level of personal security, the people have a relatively low level of stress in their lives. This, combined with a healthy diet, blesses them with unusually long lifespans." End quote. The average European lifespan in the year 1600 was less than 50 years old, and that's not including the 1/3 of the population who never survived past the age of 5. In contrast, Inuit women practiced birth control and family planning to ensure that babies had the best chance of survival, and Cherokee women gave birth in a clean environment and bathed their babies in the river every day for 2 years. In the words of Mi'kmaq elder Daniel Paul, "We were not the savages." In 1898, a railway was built across Mi'kmaq territory in Newfoundland. A swarm of foreign settlers and recreational hunters descended on the island, reducing the caribou population from between 200,000 and 300,000 heads to near extinction by the year 1930. The indigenous economy was decimated, and by 1949, Newfoundland had no choice but to join the British Canadian state. There are many examples of peaceful and abundant nations across the North American continent. The colonial narrative would have us think otherwise, though. There is a persistent minimalization of population numbers, as well as representations of this continent as terra nullius, an empty land for the taking, rather than the home of some of the world's most advanced cultures, if we are defining advancement in terms of health, equality, safety, and security. As Ray Tatana Horrence Fadden said, quote, "White people in this country, whether they realize it or not, are actually living more the way the Indians lived at the time of Columbus, thinking and governing themselves today the way the Indians did at the time of Columbus, eating foods that Indians ate at the time of Columbus, than the way that Europeans lived at the time of Columbus." In the 1880s, the Dominion of Canada outlawed the Potlatch Ceremony. The word potlatch means gift in Chinook jargon. Potlatch was a social system of redistribution, where it was a great honor to share resources and wealth with people in need. Canadian historian John Lutz points out that the potlatch system was not compatible with capitalism, and the corporate lobbyists in early Canada fought to destroy it. The Indian Act stated, quote, "Every Indian or other person who engages in or assists in celebrating the Indian festival known as the potlatch, or in the Indian dance known as the tamanawas, is guilty of a misdemeanor and liable to imprisonment. And every Indian or person who encourages an Indian to get up such a festival shall be liable to the same punishment." The system of redistribution was outlawed and the colonial model was enforced. Native people were ushered into manual labor jobs across the rapidly changing continent. Catholic missionary Saint-Jean Grandidier wrote that the Indians in this part of the country are now quite awake to the necessity of working, of following the examples of the whites. They look to the future and are afraid for their children's sake if they do not work. The ban on potlatch was removed in Canada in the 1950s, just after the final province joined Canada and the nation's borders and sovereignty over First Nations lands were solidified. In the relatively short time span of colonial governance, the forests were stripped, 20 million hectares since the year 2000 alone. The waters, once teeming with salmon, so thick that explorer Nicolas Denis couldn't sleep beside the river from the sound of the fish, were depleted. In the 1500s, Jacques Cartier wrote of the coastal seabird, the auk, quote, "All the ships of France might load a cargo of them without once perceiving that any had been removed." The last great auk of this land was dead by 1800. Settlers covered thousands of kilometers and counting, of rich, fertile soil with landfills, toppling piles of capitalism's excrement. The implementation of the capitalist model in the Americas drove people to compete with each other to amass wealth instead of working together in harmony with nature and one another to build a healthy, peaceful, and collectively abundant society. The capitalist model has had a stultifying effect, inducing a zombie-like state where people can watch videos of turtles and whales struggling in marine trash and then continue sipping from their plastic bottles of water. Walmart was found criminally responsible for pouring millions of pounds of toxic waste into the water table, making children sick. And still, people stormed the sale racks on Black Friday to give money to the people who did it, investing in that company with every swipe of their credit cards. Downsview, the former Canadian Air Force Base in North York, Toronto, was supposed to become Canada's first urban national park, 250 acres of lush, green public space. The project was called Tree City by international visionary design team Bruce Ma and Rem Koolhaas in the year 2000. In 2013, Mattamy Homes, the company building suburban row houses as far as the eye can see, got their strangling fingers on the project. Goodbye, Tree City. And still those residential developments can't sell fast enough. But then, something changed. Last year, after a heated 20-year struggle, environmentalist organizations, foresting companies, First Nations, and colonial governments signed a strict sustainable logging agreement to preserve the Great Bear Rainforest, the largest coastal temperate rainforest in the world. Hollywood envisions a world torn apart by corporate greed, an environmental disaster of biblical proportions. We shuffle toward our bleak futures like zombies in The Walking Dead, like lemmings plummeting off a cliff. The world is ending, not tomorrow, but maybe the day after. The truth is, the world doesn't end. It gets worse or it gets better, based on our choices. Decisions like the one to preserve the Great Bear Rainforest for future generations are not easy. But in the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. Now, let's imagine that it's the year 3017, and we're looking back on history. In 2015, Vancouver implemented a zero-emissions building plan. Cities across Canada followed suit. Ottawa made the downtown core a beautiful pedestrian-only space, built a solar light rail system, and converted the old transitway into a bicycle thoroughfare. Montreal, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and Moose Jaw revolutionized city living by building arcologies, self-sustained, green, communal living spaces. In Toronto, the big smoke, the number of air pollution hospitalizations began to evaporate as a suburban sprawl was redeveloped into self-sustained green urban luxury pods connected to a super-fast hydrogen convoy system that would take you across the city to your friend's neighborhood in less than an hour. The designs of cities themselves changed slowly over time as people's outlook on urban space shifted. By 2050, all new urban buildings were carbon neutral. If you want inspiration for what that looks like, check out Algonquin College's new Ottawa facilities. Cityscapes changed slowly, barely perceptible at first. The sharp edges of buildings rounding and softening, flowing more in tune with the landscape instead of battling against it. Colors and shapes reflected the changing seasons. From the hills beyond the city, through the smog-free air, the metropolis looked magnificent, like the intelligent design of some kind of incredible creature. A spider's web, a beaver's lodge, a precisely crafted nest. From space, these human cities look like the design of intelligent clockmakers. Oh look, a brilliant species, aliens would say, rather than, oh look, a toxic dump. These creatures defecate where they eat. The street level of the city of now is dominated by cars. Roads, parking lots, traffic lights, pedestrians step quickly between honking vehicles, afraid to be crushed. In 3017, the city doesn't run on oil. Ground level of the metropolis is not street level. It's a dynamic communal living space. Rather than windy corridors of automobiles, there are clean swimming holes in the summer and skating rinks in the winter. There are places to eat, to lay in the sun, and light-filled spaces to do creative work. A SkyTrain weaves around the city on a track made of some kind of genetically engineered bamboo, carrying people from place to place to place. Getting there was not easy. Technology had been replacing hard labor jobs since the 1950s, steadily increasing over time. After the internet revolution, components of every job were automated. 2030 was the tipping point of late capitalism, where over 50% of jobs were completely eliminated by machines. Companies with greater and greater wealth had fewer and fewer paid workers, like Instagram sold for $1 billion with only 30 employees. As automation took over jobs in the retail, service, and manufacturing industries, there was simply not enough work to sustain the masses. Large numbers of highly skilled workers fought for limited time positions, and basic modern living became unaffordable. There was not enough paid work for humans to perform for 5 days per week. There was an employment crisis. The amenities of the automated future of 3017 were not compatible with the capitalist model of the colonial period. MINCOME, or minimum income programs, called guillotine insurance by the rich, eased society into the post-work week model of living, leaving people much more time for educational and creative pursuits, while ensuring a standard of living that prevented a violent revolution. The entire population became highly educated, with extensive knowledge of earth sciences and electrical and software engineering. A new enlightenment, the dawn of a new age of invention, blossomed. With corporate-controlled wage labor eliminated, the power of science and the human mind was harnessed to innovate solutions to environmental degradation and comfortable, healthy, creative, sustainable living. The human mind is capable of anything, and the capitalist system forced people to use their intelligence and energy against one another. When that power was channeled toward collective good, poverty, illness, inequality were eliminated. You may say I'm a dreamer, and that this vision of utopia is impossible, but everything seems impossible until it is done. Not only do I think that this future is inevitable eventually, but I believe that we have a rich and incredible history of social models to plan and inspire this future. Accounts of societies whose governance centers on economic equality did not fit into the colonial period model of human progress. As the colonial period comes to an end, these accounts are more important than ever to envision a life-friendly future. Imagine with me, a truly post-colonial Solarpunk society. The brilliant governance and social structures of First Nations patterned on an automated, sustainable techno-biome that respects and reflects the earth that is our home. First Nations examples of pre-capitalist economies of the commons provide frameworks for visioning futuristic settings of what post-capitalism can look like.